She had the evidence. She had the files. She had 6 years of proof that the man running Hartwell Memorial Hospital had been stealing from dying patients, and she handed it directly to the people who destroyed her for it. At 5:47 in the morning, with the cleaning crew still mopping the lobby floors, Nurse Mara Voss was escorted out of the building she had given everything to. No hearing, no warning, just a printed termination notice and a security guard who wouldn't look her in the eye. The director smiled as she left. He stopped smiling 11 minutes later. If this story has you on edge already, follow along and don't leave. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning Mara Voss was fired, it had been raining since midnight. Not the dramatic kind of rain that arrives like a warning, just the slow, gray, indifferent kind that soaks into everything and doesn't stop. The kind that makes 5 a.m. feel like the middle of a night that never actually ended. She had driven to work in it, parked in the same spot she always used in the northeast corner of the employee lot because the drainage near the south entrance flooded in weather like this, and she'd ruined a pair of shoes there once. She remembered that. A stupid thing to remember on a morning like this one, but that's how the brain works when it's bracing for something it already senses coming. Mara was 34 years old. She had worked at Hartwell Memorial Hospital in the city of Caldervane for 6 years, the last 3 of those in the emergency department where the real work happened. The chaotic, grinding, deeply unglamorous work of keeping people alive long enough for the rest of the hospital to do its job. Before Hartwell, she had spent 4 years in the Army as a combat medic, attached to a forward surgical team in a deployment she rarely talked about. She had come home with a commendation she kept in a box in her closet, and a particular way of staying calm when everything around her was falling apart, which had turned out to be the most useful thing she'd brought back. She was not calm on the morning she was fired, but she held it together. She had practice. The call to Director Elliot Garvin's office had come the night before, just after her shift ended. His assistant had left a voicemail. Professional, neutral, nothing alarming in the words themselves, but something in the pacing that made her stomach drop the moment she heard it. Director Garvin would like to meet with you at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. Please come directly to the administrative wing. She had listened to it twice standing in the hospital parking garage, her keys in her hand, rain starting to spot the concrete around her feet. Then she had driven home, made coffee she barely touched, and sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours looking at the copied files she'd been quietly assembling for the past 4 months. She had known this meeting was coming. She just hadn't known how fast. Hartwell Memorial was a mid-sized regional hospital, not prestigious enough to attract the kind of staff that got written up in medical journals, but large enough to matter deeply to the 250,000 people in Caldervane who relied on it. The emergency department processed somewhere between 60 and 90 patients a day. The obstetrics floor was perpetually understaffed. The pediatric unit had been waiting on equipment upgrades for 2 years, stalled every quarter by budget reviews that went nowhere. The budget shortages were the thing that had started all of it for Mara. 18 months ago, she had been asked to sign off on an emergency supply requisition. Standard procedure. Nurses in her position co-signed procurement paperwork as part of the department's internal audit trail. The form was ordinary enough, but the vendor name didn't match anything in the system she recognized, and when she cross-referenced the invoice number with the hospital's central procurement database, it came back empty. No contract on file. No corresponding purchase order. Just a line item for $43,000 going to a company called Meridian Supply Partners, LLC, that, as far as Mara could determine, did not have a functioning website or a physical address that checked out. She had flagged it with her supervisor at the time, a charge nurse named Pat, who had looked at the form for about 15 seconds and told her it was probably just a new vendor the purchasing department had added without updating the directory yet, and not to worry about it. Mara had worried about it anyway. Not aggressively at first. She'd submitted a written question to the procurement office through the hospital's internal messaging system, which was the correct channel for that kind of inquiry, and received a reply 3 days later that explained the vendor was a newly contracted regional supplier and the system directory would be updated soon. The response had a name attached to it, someone in the administrative accounting division, and the signature looked legitimate, so she had noted it in a personal log she kept and moved on. But then 3 months later, she saw a different invoice with a different vendor name and a different amount and the same missing contract trail. And then 2 months after that, another. Each one moving through the system with enough paperwork around it to look routine, but not quite enough to actually be routine, if you were looking carefully and knew what you were supposed to see. Mara had started looking carefully. It had taken her the better part of a year to understand what she was actually looking at. Not because she was slow. She was methodical, which is different. She was not an accountant. She had no forensic finance background. What she had was a combat medic's instinct for pattern recognition and a stubborn, almost compulsive resistance to accepting an explanation that didn't fully account for the data in front of her. In the field, that quality had kept her alive more than once. In a hospital administrative building, it led her to a set of conclusions she would have preferred not to reach. Elliot Garvin had been director of Hartwell Memorial for 7 years. He was 51, polished, the kind of administrator who spoke fluently in the language of patient outcomes and community health equity at board meetings while quietly running the hospital like a personal instrument. He was well regarded in Caldervane's civic community. His photograph appeared on the hospital's donor wall alongside a plaque crediting his leadership for a major facility renovation 4 years prior. What the plaque did not mention was that the renovation had been funded in part by emergency care budget allocations that had subsequently vanished from the hospital's financial records in ways that were technically possible to explain: equipment depreciation adjustments, grant fund reallocation, third-party service contracts. But that, taken together across multiple fiscal years, did not add up to anything legitimate. Mara had spreadsheets. She had printed copies of procurement documents she had accessed through her system permissions and photographed with her phone. She had a timeline, constructed carefully, showing how the pattern of false vendor invoices had evolved over roughly 5 years, and what the total extracted amount appeared to be. The number she had arrived at, conservatively, was just over $2.3 million. Emergency care funds. The money that was supposed to cover trauma response equipment, critical drug stockpiles, disaster preparedness supplies, backup generator fuel contracts. The money that kept the ED running when everything else went wrong. She had reported it internally 3 weeks ago. She'd written a formal memo, attached her documentation, and submitted it to the hospital's compliance office using the correct whistleblower reporting procedure. The compliance officer, a man named Dale Birch, who had been in that role for 11 years, had acknowledged receipt. She had not heard anything further. What she had not known at the time was that Dale Birch reported directly to Elliot Garvin, Apas. The administrative wing at Hartwell was separated from the clinical areas by a set of glass-paneled double doors that always felt to Mara like a boundary between two different institutions. The hospital proper smelled of antiseptic and breakfast trays, and the particular close warmth of bodies and machines. The administrative side smelled of carpet cleaner and expensive coffee and quiet. The lighting was softer. The sounds were muffled. She arrived at Garvin's outer office at 6:58 a.m. His assistant, a young woman Mara vaguely recognized but had never spoken to, told her to wait and gestured toward a chair without looking up from her monitor. Mara sat. The chair was unnecessarily comfortable, the kind of furniture chosen to project calm authority. She put her bag on the floor between her feet and looked at the wall. She had come in early because she had things to do before this meeting. Specifically, between 5:15 and 6:40 that morning, working from a hospital-issue laptop she had checked out 2 weeks ago for a compliance review project and had not yet returned, she had uploaded the complete set of her documentation to an encrypted file-sharing account she'd set up through a service she'd paid for with a personal card. The files were sitting there now, accessible via a link she had sent to 3 places: her personal email, a USB drive currently inside her jacket pocket, and the private message inbox of a man named Colonel Dwight Farrow, U.S. Army retired, who had been her commanding officer during her second deployment and whom she had called twice in the past 6 weeks. She had not told Farrow everything. She had told him enough. She had also, the night before, submitted a formal complaint to the state's Office of Healthcare Financial Oversight using their anonymous online portal, attaching the same file set via the secure upload function. She had done it on her phone, using her home internet, before she went to bed. The confirmation receipt was in her email. She had then tried to sleep, failed substantially, and driven here in the rain. Garvin kept her waiting 7 minutes past the hour, which she suspected was intentional. When his assistant finally waved her through, Mara picked up her bag and walked in. The office was large and oriented to impress. A wide desk facing the door, floor-to-ceiling windows behind it that would have shown Caldervain's downtown skyline if it hadn't been for the clouds sitting low and gray across everything. Garvin was already standing when she entered, which was a choice. It put the power of movement on his side before she even sat down. Standing beside him was Dale Birch. And beside Birch was a man she didn't recognize. Middle-aged, suit that cost more than the furniture, a kind of deliberate blankness in his expression that she had come to associate with attorneys who billed by the quarter hour. "Ms. Voss," Garvin said. "Director Garvin." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat. He did not. "I'll be direct," he said, which in her experience meant he intended to be strategic rather than direct. "We've had a chance to review the materials you submitted to compliance. There are serious concerns about how you accessed certain financial documents that were outside the normal scope of your clinical role." "I accessed them through my existing system permissions," she said. "The same permissions I've had for 3 years. Permissions granted for procurement cosign functions, not for extended financial review across multiple fiscal years." He let that sit for a moment. "There's also the question of what you did with those documents, whether they were shared externally." "I filed a compliance report," she said, "through the system you have for exactly that purpose. You also accessed the accounting server last Wednesday at 11:43 p.m., Birch said. It was the first thing he'd said since she'd walked in. His voice had the particular flatness of a man reciting something he'd prepared. "I was reviewing documents relevant to my report." "After hours. From a terminal in a restricted administrative area." She looked at him. "I had keycard access to that area. You can check the logs." "We have checked the logs," the lawyer said quietly. "That's the issue." Garvin folded his hands on the desk. "We're not going to make this more complicated than it needs to be. You went beyond your role. You accessed systems you weren't authorized to use in the manner you used them. And you've created a situation that puts this institution's data security in a difficult position. Under the circumstances, we don't see a path forward that keeps you on staff here." The room was very quiet. Rain tapped against the windows. Somewhere in the clinical floors below, an intercom chimed. "You're terminating me," she said, "effective immediately." She took a breath, let it out slowly. "I want that in writing, today. You'll receive formal documentation within 24 hours in accordance with today," she said again, and something in her voice made him stop. "You will have your attorney draft a written termination notice stating the grounds before I leave this building. If the documentation you're describing is as airtight as you seem to believe, that shouldn't be a problem." Garvin studied her for a moment. Some version of calculation moved behind his eyes. "Fine," he said. "Wait outside." The notice took 40 minutes to produce. She waited in the outer office, her bag in her lap, and watched the morning shift nurses move through the corridor visible through the glass wall. She knew most of them. Elena from the surgical prep floor stopped and looked at her with a question in her expression, and Mara gave a small, controlled shake of her head. "Not now." Elena moved on. At 8:03 a.m., the assistant brought out a sealed envelope and handed it to her without speaking. Mara opened it there, read it through once, folded it, and put it in her jacket pocket next to the USB drive. She walked out through the administrative wing doors and back into the clinical corridor. She passed the nurses' station on the second floor, where 3 of her colleagues were charting. She passed the break room where someone had burned coffee again, the smell hanging in the air with familiar stubbornness. She passed the trauma bay where she had spent more hours of her life than she could accurately count. She walked to the main elevator, pressed the lobby button, and stood watching the floors descend. In the lobby, a security guard she recognized, Marcus, who always had coffee at the desk and had once lent her his umbrella during a rainstorm she'd arrived unprepared for, was standing near the front entrance. He didn't look at her exactly, but he shifted his position slightly in a way that made it clear he was there to see her out. "Morning, Marcus," she said. "Morning, Mara." He paused. "You okay?" "I've had better mornings." She stopped at the front desk and signed out her visitor badge, the one she'd been given that morning as a visitor, not an employee, and set it on the counter. "You can tell them I left voluntarily, signed out, didn't make a scene. You can put that in whatever report you have to write." Marcus didn't say anything, but he held the door for her, which was more than his job required. She walked out into the rain. She sat in her car for almost 4 minutes, not moving. The engine wasn't running. The rain was coming down harder now, and the sound of it on the roof was constant and close. The kind of sound that fills a space completely and makes it feel both enclosed and very exposed. She had her phone in her hand without quite remembering taking it out of her pocket. She thought about calling her brother, who lived in Thornwick, and who worried about her in the patient, long-distance way of someone who had learned that worrying openly didn't help. She thought about calling her friend Dara, who was also a nurse and who would immediately say the right things in all the wrong ways. She put the phone in the cup holder. She had known this was coming. She had known it was likely coming the moment she filed that compliance report 3 weeks ago and received nothing but automated acknowledgement in return. She had known it was a possibility when she set up the encrypted backup account and sent the files to Pharaoh. She had understood, intellectually, that she was walking into that office this morning and was not going to walk out of it with her job. Understanding something and sitting in a parking lot in the rain experiencing it are, it turned out, different things. She gave herself those 4 minutes. Then she started the car. What she needed to do next was the one thing she had been explicitly advised not to do by the attorney she had consulted, briefly, over the phone, 2 weeks ago, who had warned her very clearly that going back into the hospital or attempting to speak directly to colleagues about the pending matter would compromise her position legally. She drove around the block and came back. Not to the main entrance. She used the employee lot exit she wasn't supposed to access anymore and badged through the rear clinical entrance. Her badge still worked, which told her they hadn't deactivated it yet, which told her the termination processing was slower than Garvin wanted it to look, and took the back stairwell to the 3rd floor where the senior physicians had their charting offices. She needed someone was standing inside the hospital to see what she had before whatever Garvin's next move was. She knocked on the door of Dr. Warren Osai, who was a 15-year veteran of Hartwell's cardiology department, who had once told her during a particularly bad shift that she was the most competent emergency nurse he'd worked alongside and that he meant it. He was someone she had chosen in advance as the person to go to if it came to this. He opened the door. Mara. He looked at her, then past her into the corridor. I heard something happened this morning. Yes. She held up the USB drive. I need 20 minutes of your time. Osei's expression moved through several things quickly. He was a careful man, not given to impulse, and she watched him calculate. Come in, he said finally. She plugged the drive into his office computer while he stood with his arms folded, and she walked him through the first layer of documentation, the vendor invoices, the missing contracts, the bank transfer records she'd reconstructed from the procurement system's transaction logs. She kept it factual and moved quickly, knowing she didn't have much time and that every minute she was inside this building she was technically trespassing. Osei didn't say much while she talked. He leaned forward when she got to the timeline, and she saw his jaw tighten. 2.3 million, he said when she finished. Conservatively. The actual number is probably closer to 2.8. He was quiet for a moment. Why are you showing me this now? Because I need you to request an independent IT audit of the accounting server's deletion logs before IT gets an instruction from the administrative wing to run a cleanup. If the right person makes that request in the next hour, the records survive. If they don't, there's a version of this where I have copies of everything, but the originals are gone, and the story becomes about whether my copies were fabricated. Osei looked at her steadily. You're asking me to stick my neck out? Yes. He said nothing for long enough that she started mentally walking through her next option, which was thinner. I need to think, he said. Give me some time to... Warren. She kept her voice level. I know what I'm asking. I also know what's in those files. If this runs quietly and goes away, the emergency department continues operating on a budget that was robbed to fund someone's personal accounts, while we made do with broken equipment and supply shortages. That happened on our watch. It happened while we were both in this building doing our jobs. He rubbed the back of his neck, looked at the screen, looked at her. I'll make some calls, he said. Thank you. She took the USB drive and left. In the elevator going down, she allowed herself to breathe for the first time in what felt like hours. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. An unknown number, a Caldervane area code she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She was running on about 3 hours of sleep, and the particular hollow exhaustion of a morning that had gone as badly as she'd expected while still feeling, somehow, worse than she'd been prepared for. She was also technically walking out of a building she'd been terminated from, badge still on her wrist, documentation case still in her head, and she didn't need a complication. She answered anyway. "Voss," she said. The voice on the other end was unhurried, deliberate. It had the quality of someone who was used to being listened to and therefore never rushed. "Ms. Voss, this is Special Investigator Lena Crow, Office of Healthcare Financial Oversight. I'm calling in reference to a complaint submission we received at 11:57 p.m. last night. I want you to know we've reviewed the attachments." Mara stopped walking. She was in the lobby now, and Marcus was at the desk, and the rain outside the glass doors was still coming down, and she stood very still with the phone pressed to her ear. "You've already reviewed them," she said. "Yes." "And?" A pause, not hesitation, consideration. "Ms. Voss, I need you to stay inside the building." The elevator behind her chimed. She didn't turn around. "Why?" she said, though somewhere behind her sternum she already knew. "Because we have a team 2 minutes from your location, and we'd prefer you to be present when we go in." She didn't move for a full 3 seconds. The lobby of Hartwell Memorial was doing what lobbies do at 8:30 in the morning. Volunteers at the information desk, a couple in winter coats waiting near the elevator bank, a dietary aide pushing a cart stacked with breakfast trays, and none of it had any idea what was about to happen to it. Mara stood in the middle of all that ordinary motion, with the phone still at her ear, and felt the particular sensation of a situation that had been moving on a slow fuse, suddenly reaching the end of the wire. "Where are you right now?" Crow asked. "Main lobby, ground floor." "Good. Don't badge back into the clinical areas. Stay where you are. If anyone from administration approaches you, you don't have to say anything." "My badge still works," Mara said. "They haven't cut it." A beat. "I know, we asked them not to." That stopped her. "How long have you been watching this?" "Ms. Voss." Crow's voice didn't shift in register, but something in it changed slightly. A precision that hadn't been there a moment ago, like a lens adjusting. "I'll explain the timeline when we're in the building. What I need from you right now is for you to sit down somewhere visible and stay calm." "I am calm." "I know you are. I'm saying it for the benefit of anyone watching you." Mara looked up slowly and scanned the lobby the way she'd learned to scan rooms and environments where the ceiling could fall on you. Security camera above the main entrance. Another above the elevator bank. A third covering the corridor toward the administrative wing. In the small, windowed office adjacent to the security desk, she could see the back of Marcus's head, and past him, the face of a man she didn't recognize who was standing in that office looking at a monitor with his arms crossed. She walked to the seating area near the far window, an arrangement of chairs that faced the exterior glass and gave her a clear sight line to the parking lot, and sat down. The rain was still falling. The lot was about a third full at this hour, and at the far edge of it, just past the row of staff vehicles, she could see 2 dark sedans parked side by side that had not been there when she walked out 40 minutes ago. Government plates. No markings. A man in a charcoal overcoat standing beside the nearer one, looking at his phone. "I can see your team," she said into the phone. "Don't look at them directly." She dropped her gaze to the floor. "How many people know we're talking?" "Right now? 3. Another pause, shorter. "Ms. Voss, I want to be straightforward with you. The complaint you filed last night gave us a legal basis to move faster than we would have otherwise, but we were already building this. What you submitted filled in gaps that would have taken us weeks to reconstruct. You should know that." She absorbed this. "How long?" 7 months. 7 months. She had been building her own file for 14. For more than half that time, there had apparently been people on the other side of this wall she hadn't known existed, working the same problem from a different angle, and no one had told her, and she had spent those months thinking she was doing this completely alone. She did not let herself feel anything about that right now. She would feel it later, in some other place, when this was finished. "What do you need from me? When we enter the building, we'll need you to identify yourself to the lead investigator as the source of last night's submission. You'll also be asked to verbally confirm the location of original documents you accessed on site. You don't have to do that without counsel present. I want to be clear about that. But the faster we can establish chain of custody on the physical records, the harder it becomes for anyone inside to claim they were altered. I have copies, she said, encrypted backup, and a physical drive. We know. We need the originals. A sound in the background on Crow's end. Voices. A door. Something being set down heavily. 2 minutes, Ms. Voss. The line went quiet, but didn't disconnect. No. She counted her heartbeats. It was something she had started doing in the field when the adrenaline got too large for the situation. Not to slow down, but to stay calibrated. You couldn't run a trauma assessment with your hands shaking. You counted. You itemized. You found the next thing that needed doing, and you did it. And then you found the next thing after that. Across the lobby, the volunteer at the information desk was handing a visitor a paper map of the hospital floors. The dietary cart disappeared around the corner. The couple near the elevator finally got on. A child in a yellow raincoat came through the front doors with a man who was probably her grandfather, the child's boots leaving small, dark prints on the tile floor. At 8:41 a.m., 4 people walked through the main entrance of Hartwell Memorial Hospital. They were dressed in business attire rather than anything marked, which was a deliberate choice Mara understood immediately. You don't announce a financial investigation to a building full of people if you're planning to preserve documents before anyone has a chance to reach them. 2 women and 2 men, moving with the particular organized purpose of people who had rehearsed the first 60 seconds of this entrance. The lead woman was somewhere in her mid-40s, dark hair cut close, a navy blazer over gray trousers, a credentials wallet already in her left hand. She swept the lobby once and found Mara in about 4 seconds. She walked directly over. Mara Voss? Yes. Lena Crow. She held up the credentials wallet briefly, long enough to show it, not long enough to be studied, which told Mara she'd done this enough times to know the difference. Thank you for staying. You asked me to. Something close to a smile. I did. She sat down in the chair beside Mara without breaking her forward momentum. Just folded herself into the seat, like this was a continuation of walking. I'm going to have my team secure the administrative wing in about 90 seconds. Before that happens, I need to know one thing. Is there anyone on the clinical staff who is actively holding physical documents related to this? Someone you passed materials to? No. She hesitated. I had a conversation with a physician on the 3rd floor this morning, Warren Ossie. I showed him digital copies from my personal drive to ask him to request an IT audit. He hasn't received any original documents. Ossie, cardiology? Crow had a small tablet out and was typing without looking at it. Yes. We'll need to speak with him. Can you let him know we're coming? Mara pulled out her phone. Give me 30 seconds. She typed a message to Ossie's cell. Federal investigators entering building now. They will come to you. Do not alarm staff. M. And sent it. Then she put her phone away and looked at Crow. Done. Crow was already standing. Ma. What followed was not dramatic in the way that things are dramatic in stories. There was no running, no shouting, no confrontation in a crowded hallway with everyone watching. Real investigations don't move that way. They move laterally, through process and paperwork, and the specific kind of controlled urgency that looks, from the outside, almost like routine. 2 of Crow's team went directly to the administrative wing. The other 2 split. One to the hospital's IT infrastructure room in the basement, the other to the 4th floor administrative accounting division. Mara followed Crow at a measured distance, and no one they passed in the corridors had any idea what was happening, which was entirely the point. They reached the administrative wing doors just as one of Crow's colleagues, a man named Reyes, who had a lanyard clipped to his jacket with a federal ID that Mara deliberately did not read because she suspected she might be nervous if she did, was already in conversation with Garvin's assistant at the outer office. The assistant looked up as they came in. Her expression did several things in quick succession. Director Garvin is in a meeting, she said. We'll need to interrupt it, Reyes said pleasantly. He had the kind of pleasant that was impervious to argument. The assistant looked at the credentials he offered. Then she picked up her phone and pressed a button. Mara heard it ring once, twice, 3 times, and go to voicemail. The assistant tried again, same result. Crow stepped forward. Is there another exit from his office? The assistant's face had gone very still. There's a side door to the records corridor. Crow looked at Reyes, who was already moving. Garvin was not in his office. The room was as Mara had left it less than 2 hours ago. The wide desk, the clouded windows, the rain-gray light coming through from the Caldervane skyline. His computer screen was dark. His chair was pushed back at an angle that suggested someone who had stood up quickly. On the desk, a ceramic coffee mug still had steam coming off it. Crow stood in the doorway and looked at the room for a moment without going in. "When did he leave?" she said to no one in particular. Reyes appeared from the side corridor. Door on the far end opens to a stairwell. Stairwell goes down to the basement loading dock. Crow typed something on her tablet. "Get someone to the loading dock and pull the badge access logs for the past 20 minutes. I want to know every door he moved through." She turned to Mara, who had stayed in the doorway because no one had invited her further in, and because crossing into a federal investigation's active scene without an explicit invitation seemed like exactly the kind of mistake that turned into a problem later. "He knew we were coming," Mara said. "Maybe." Crow's voice was measured. "Or he was already moving before we arrived. Does he have personal vehicles?" "I don't know. I know he parks in the executive lot on the east side. We have that lot covered." She stepped toward the desk and, without touching anything, looked at the surface. A notepad with the top sheet torn off. A phone. Office phone, still on the cradle. A file folder, closed. "Ms. Voss, you said the accounting server was central to what you found." "Yes. The procurement transaction logs live on that server. The original invoices, the payment authorizations. When you accessed it 3 days ago," Crow glanced at her. "That's in your complaint. When you were there at 11:43, was there any indication that records had been recently modified? Deletion timestamps? Reorganized folder structures?" The folder labeled 2021 Emergency Capital Accounts had been renamed. "When I first accessed that directory 6 weeks ago, it was called something else. And 3 of the subfolders were empty in a way that didn't match the document count in the index." Crow was already on her radio. Mara listened to half a conversation in a shorthand she mostly couldn't follow, except for one sentence near the end. "Tell them not to touch that server until Hendricks is physically in the room." She clicked off and looked back at Mara. "You did the right thing coming back in this morning," she said. "I broke my attorney's advice." "Yes." No judgment in it, just a fact sitting in the room between them. "Jose's request for the IT audit. Did he actually submit it?" "I don't know. I left before he confirmed." "We'll find out." She stepped back into the hallway. "I'm going to need you to come with us to the IT room." See, the hospital's IT infrastructure was in the basement, 2 corridors removed from the loading dock, in a room that smelled of recirculated air and electrical equipment, and the specific staleness of a space where humans were present but not the priority. 3 server racks took up most of the far wall. A systems administrator named Kevin, who looked approximately 26 and was wearing a Hartwell employee badge that said Technology Services, and who had clearly been intercepted mid-morning routine because he still had a granola bar in his hand, was standing near the entrance with Crow's second team member, a woman named Park, looking like someone who couldn't decide whether to be worried or fascinated. "This is the procurement server?" Park was asking. "That rack, second shelf up, the unit with the blue indicator light," Kevin said. He glanced at Mara. "You're the nurse from the email said." "Yes," Mara said. He looked back at Park. "The server has been running continuous backup to an off-site cloud account, standard protocol. It backs up every 6 hours automatically. Last successful backup was at 6 a.m. today." "What about the deletion logs?" Mara asked. Kevin looked at her sideways, like he wasn't sure she should be asking. Park gave a small nod. "The deletion logs," Kevin said carefully, "show a batch file execution yesterday at 11 p.m. that removed approximately 300 files from the Emergency Capital Accounts directory." He swallowed. "That's not normal. That's not something that happens automatically. Someone ran that manually." The room was quiet. "Can you tell whose credentials were used?" Park asked. "The execution ran under a service account, which means someone used administrative-level credentials to hide who initiated it." He paused. "But the service account access log still shows the terminal it ran from. It ran from the director's private workstation." Mara took that in. She had suspected it. Suspecting something and hearing it confirmed out loud. In a basement with federal investigators, with documentation sitting on a server rack 3 feet away, were still different experiences. She thought about 11 months ago when she had first started keeping notes. She thought about the nights she'd sat at her kitchen table second-guessing herself, questioning her own methodology, running and rerunning the numbers looking for an alternative explanation that made all of it innocent. She thought about the compliance report she'd filed 3 weeks ago and the automated replies she'd gotten back, and the way Dale Birch had stood in Garvin's office this morning with his prepared statement about unauthorized access. $2.3 million. Emergency care funds, taken quietly and continuously for 5 years while the emergency department scraped for supplies and the pediatric floor waited on equipment that never came. She pressed her thumb against the edge of the USB drive in her jacket pocket, just for a moment, and then let go. Was the 6 a.m. backup captured before the deletions were overwritten? She asked. Kevin shook his head. The deletions happened at 11 p.m. The backup at 6 a.m. captured the post-deletion state. Those files are gone from the server. He hesitated. But the backup at midnight 2 nights ago, that one captured the files before they were deleted. That backup exists on the off-site account. So the originals are on the cloud backup from 48 hours ago, Park said. Yes. Can you pull that backup? I can, but I'd need authorization from... He stopped. Looked at the credentials folder Park set on the desk in front of him. Read it. That'll work? The next hour and 40 minutes moved the way investigations move when they've shifted from building to executing. Methodical, relentless, boring in a way that was actually its own kind of tense. Mara was asked to wait in a conference room on the second floor that had been temporarily cleared by Crow's team, and she did. And she ate a granola bar someone left on the table that she suspected was Kevin's and told herself she'd pay it back later. And she read through her own documentation again on her phone screen for no reason other than having something to do with her hands. Outside the glass wall of the conference room, the hospital was trying to behave normally. Staff moved through the corridor on their usual rhythms, charts, and coffee cups, and the perpetual low-grade urgency of clinical work. Word was clearly moving through the building. She could see it in the slightly too deliberate pace of the nurses she recognized. The clusters of 2 or 3 that lasted a beat longer than they should before dispersing. The way doctor. Vasquez from the surgical floor walked past the conference room window twice in 15 minutes without looking in. They knew something was happening. They didn't know what. At 10:17 a.m., Crow came in and sat down across from Mara. We have the backup files, she said. 4,300 documents recovered from the pre-deletion state. Your procurement records are in there, intact. Mara exhaled. Well, we also have bank transfer records subpoenaed from the hospital's external accounts this morning. They match the vendor payment trails in your documentation with significant overlap. Crow folded her hands on the table. I want to be honest with you about where we are. This is enough to hold and to charge. It is not yet enough to fully close. There will be a period of review, formal proceedings, and Garvin's legal team will contest at every step. That process takes time. Where is he was? Crow's expression didn't change. We located him at 9:52 in a parking structure 3 blocks from the hospital. He was taken into custody without incident. Mara looked at the table. Process that. Who else? Dale Birch is being interviewed on the 4th floor right now. 2 individuals in the Administrative Accounting Division have been placed on administrative suspension pending further review. She paused. There are likely more. This level of financial operation rarely runs with only a handful of participants. What about the compliance office? The report I filed 3 weeks ago. We're aware that it was received and not forwarded. That's being looked at. Crow's voice didn't add anything to that. No inflection, no preview, just the statement sitting cleanly between them. Mara nodded. What happens to me? Legally? You're a protected complainant under the state's healthcare whistleblower statute. The termination this morning is, at minimum, going to require Hartwell's board to review whether it constitutes retaliatory discharge. She paused. Which it does. That review will take some time, but the legal footing is clear. I'm not asking about the legal part, Mara said. I know the legal part. I had 3 months to read the statutes. She looked at Crow directly. I'm asking what happens now, today, to me. Crow was quiet for a moment. She studied Mara with the particular attention of someone who had learned, over years, to look at people rather than at the situation they were embedded in. You go home, she said. You rest. You answer questions when we ask them through the proper channels. A beat. And you let us do the part of this that requires a badge that isn't yours. It was not a particularly warm thing to say, but it was an honest one, and Mara found she respected it more for that. Okay, she said. She stood up, and Crow stood with her, and they shook hands in the conference room with the rain still running down the windows. And that was that. Chet, except it wasn't. She found Warren Osei on her way out, standing near the stairwell door on the second floor, with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who had spent the last 2 hours processing several things at once. They came up, he said. I know. I told them you had digital copies, not originals. They asked me about the IT audit request. I submitted it. Before your text came, I'd submitted it about 40 minutes earlier. He rubbed his jaw. I wasn't sure I was going to, and then I decided I was being a coward and submitted it. It probably didn't change the outcome much, she said. They had enough. It mattered to me. He said it flatly, without self-congratulation, just a fact he was putting in the record. Are you all right? I was terminated this morning. I know. He held her gaze. I'm asking if you're all right. She thought about it honestly, which she wasn't always willing to do. Not particularly, she said, but I'm standing up and the people I'm angry at are having a significantly worse morning than I am, so... He almost smiled. Is there anything... No, thank you, Warren. She took the stairs down and went out through the side entrance to avoid the main lobby, because she had already made her exit once this morning, and doing it twice in front of the same security cameras felt excessive. She walked through the rain to her car and got in and sat with the engine running and the heat on in her hands in her lap. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, different from Crow's. A Caldervane area code, but not one she recognized. She opened it. Ms. Voss. This is Colonel Dwight Farrow. I'm in Caldervane, drove up last night. I've been in contact with the investigative team since 0600. There's something they haven't told you yet. When you're ready to talk, call me. Take your time. You've done enough for one morning. She read it twice. Something they haven't told you yet. She set the phone on the passenger seat and looked at it for a long moment. Outside, the rain had shifted direction slightly in the wind and was coming at the car windows sideways now, the kind of angle that finds every seal and tests it. The parking lot was beginning to fill in that early midday way. A new set of visitor cars pulling in, people in coats moving fast between vehicles and the entrance. Ordinary. Normal. None of them knowing that somewhere in the building behind them, investigators were working through documents that were about to change what this hospital looked like from the inside out. She picked the phone back up. She had 3 questions she would have asked Crow if Crow were the kind of person to answer them the way she needed them answered right now. She had, over the past 4 months, developed a particular and functional tolerance for not knowing things she needed to know, for operating on partial information, for making the next correct move without full visibility of the board. That tolerance had limits. She was close to them now. Farrow had driven up from his home, wherever that was, the night before. He had been in contact with the investigative team since 6 in the morning. He had said there was something the team hadn't told her. The question she couldn't answer was whether that something was better than what she already knew or significantly worse. Her thumb moved over Farrow's number. She pressed call. It rang once. Ms. Voss. His voice was exactly as she remembered it, low, unhurried, with the quality of someone who had made a career of delivering information in situations where people's hands were shaking. How are you holding up? I've been asked that twice in the last hour. I'll give you the same answer I gave both times. Not particularly well, but functional. Fair enough? A pause that wasn't empty. It had weight in it, the kind of pause that precedes something being set down on a table. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it through to the end before you respond. Understood. The vendor network Garvin used, the false invoices, the shell companies. The investigators traced the first entity, Meridian Supply Partners, back further than your documentation went. What they found is that Meridian is one of 7 entities connected to a single holding structure. The holding structure has been used in financial operations at 3 other regional healthcare facilities in this state over the past 8 years. He stopped. Garvin didn't build this alone, and he may not have built it first. The rain against the car roof was very loud for a moment. There's a larger network, she said. Yes. And by filing the complaint and moving when I did, You may have triggered activity in the other facilities. He said it without apology because there was nothing to apologize for. It was just a consequence, a thing that happened when you pulled on a thread without knowing how long it ran. The investigative team is coordinating with 2 other regional offices right now. They're concerned about document destruction at the affiliated facilities. They moved fast here because you gave them leverage. They're trying to use that leverage before the signal reaches the other nodes. She stared through the windshield at the blurred gray shape of the hospital entrance. How many people are involved? They don't know yet. That's the honest answer. But Ms. Voss, he paused. What you found here isn't the whole thing. It's the part they finally have on record. And the people who built the rest of it know that record exists now. She kept her voice even. Are you telling me I should be worried? Farrow was quiet for 3 seconds. 4. 5. I'm telling you, he said, that you should not be alone tonight. The word alone sat in the car with her like a third person. Farrow wasn't the type to say things for effect. She had known him across 2 deployments and a handful of phone calls over the years since, and in all of that she had never once heard him use a word he didn't mean precisely. He was not telling her to be afraid. He was telling her to be smart, which was a different thing, and she understood the distinction because she was the same way. I have a brother in Thornwick, she said. Call him. You think this moves that fast? I think the people who built a 7-entity holding structure across multiple healthcare facilities over 8 years are not unsophisticated. And I think the moment Garvin was taken into custody, someone in that network got a signal. He paused. I'm not saying anything happens. I'm saying don't assume the morning's work closed everything it opened. Understood. She looked at the hospital entrance. Farrow, what's the military's involvement in this? You said you'd been in contact with the investigative team since 6 this morning. A beat. When you reached out to me 6 weeks ago, I made some calls of my own. The original financial manipulation involved emergency medical procurement contracts that were routed through a vendor network that also held expired federal supply contracts from a DoD medical logistics program. That creates a jurisdictional overlap. Another pause, longer. There are people paying attention to this who have a different kind of authority than the State Oversight Office. They've been watching the holding structure independently. She absorbed this. You're telling me this is bigger than Hartwell. I'm telling you Hartwell is the part that's now visible. The rest is still being looked at by people who have not introduced themselves to you yet. She started to ask another question and then stopped because she recognized the edge of what Farrow would and wouldn't tell her on an unsecured phone line, and she had reached it. Okay, she said. Thank you for driving up. You did good work, he said. Get some rest if you can. She ended the call and sat with the engine running and thought, with a clarity she found surprising given how tired she was, about the shape of what she was actually inside. She had walked into Garvin's office this morning thinking she was dealing with one corrupt administrator at one hospital. She had filed a complaint against a man who had stolen emergency funds from a mid-sized regional medical center in a mid-sized city. That had been the perimeter of it, as far as she had understood it. The perimeter was, apparently, much larger. She pulled out of the parking lot and drove home through the rain. Her apartment was a second-floor unit in a building on Calvert Street, 9 blocks from the hospital, that she had rented for 4 years because it had a parking space included and a laundry room on the same floor and enough space between it and its neighbors that she could come home from a night shift without worrying about waking anyone. She had never decorated it particularly. There were books on a shelf, a print on the wall her brother had given her that she liked well enough, a kitchen that was functional, and a bedroom that was primarily for sleeping. It suited her. She had never quite gotten around to making it feel permanent, which she had occasionally wondered about and then put aside. She locked the door behind her, set her bag on the kitchen table, and stood in the middle of her own apartment feeling the specific disorientation of a person who had been operating under high pressure for 6 straight hours and had suddenly, without transition, arrived somewhere quiet. She called her brother. His name was Gabe, and he picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been waiting, which meant someone had already reached him, probably Dara, who had the social connectivity of a relay tower. Mara. His voice carried 3 months of stored worry in 2 syllables. I'm fine. Dara texted me. She said there were federal investigators at the hospital. There were? She said you got fired. Also true. A silence in which she could hear him choosing words. Gabe was an electrician, with a careful, methodical mind and a deep discomfort with situations he couldn't fix with his hands. He was also, in a crisis, steadier than most people twice his size. "Do I need to come there?" he said. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to not make it a bigger deal than it is." She sat down at the kitchen table. "Can you come to Caldervane and stay here for a few days?" A beat. "That's a bigger deal than it sounds." "I know. Are you in danger?" "I don't think so. I've been advised not to be alone, and I trust the person who advised it." "Mara? Gabe, yes or no?" "I'll be there by 4, he said. "Don't do anything before I get there." "I'm not planning to do anything. I'm planning to sleep." "Good." He hung up. She set her phone down on the table and thought about sleeping, which was a reasonable plan and one she had meant genuinely. Then she opened her laptop and spent the next 2 hours reviewing the complete documentation set she had assembled, not looking for anything new, but running the review the way a surgeon runs a pre-operative checklist, not because you expect to find an error, but because the act of checking is itself the discipline. She was on her 3rd pass through the vendor invoice timeline when her phone rang. A number she didn't know. She answered it. "Ms. Voss." A male voice, measured, deliberate. "My name is Special Agent Thomas Reed. I'm with the Federal Financial Crimes Task Force, coordinating with the State Oversight Office on the Hartwell investigation. I apologize for the unannounced call. Do you have a few minutes?" She closed her laptop. "Yes. I want to bring you current on a development that happened in the last hour, and I want to ask you a question that may feel unusual given where we are in the process." He paused. "Is that acceptable?" "Go ahead." "The cloud backup your hospital's IT team uses routes through a third-party server management firm called Viridia Systems. Our team accessed the backup via the subpoena we executed this morning and confirmed the pre-deletion document set is intact. However, in reviewing the access logs for that cloud account, we found an access event from 2 nights ago, the night before the file deletion on the hospital server, where someone logged into the backup account remotely and viewed, but did not download or modify the document set." "Whoa!" She was very still. "Someone accessed the backup the night before Garvin deleted the originals." "Correct. Which means they knew the backup existed and were checking whether it contained the files before destroying the server copies. That's our read. What it tells us is that someone more technically sophisticated than a hospital administrator was involved in managing the cover. The access originated from an IP address registered to a commercial VPN service, so we can't directly trace the user. But the timing tells us they were aware of the plan to destroy the originals and were doing due diligence." She rubbed her jaw. "What's the question you wanted to ask me?" "In your documentation, you referenced a former colleague, someone you described as a hospital IT contractor who worked on site at Hartwell approximately 2 years ago. You noted in one of your internal memos that this person had mentioned the hospital's backup infrastructure to you informally. We'd like to speak with them." She went back through her own notes in her head. She had mentioned, in passing, in one of her early personal memos, a conversation she'd had with a contract IT worker, a man named Perry, no last name she'd written down, who had been on site for about 6 weeks configuring the new server room setup, and who had mentioned offhandedly that the backup system was cloud-rooted and that most administrators didn't know how to access it directly. She had noted it because it had seemed potentially relevant to her documentation strategy and then had not thought about it again. "Perry," she said, "I don't have a last name. He was a contractor, not staff. He left when the project ended. We found him. Perry Aldis, freelance IT contractor, currently based in Morrow City. We'd like to speak with him, and we're going to. I'm telling you because if he comes up in later proceedings, we want you to have a record that we identified him through your documentation and not through any independent channel." A pause. "And because I want you to understand that we're treating your documentation as the spine of this case, not a supplement, the spine." She felt something release in her chest that she hadn't entirely known was clenched. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Get some rest," Reed said and ended the call. She slept for 3 hours in her clothes on top of the comforter and woke to the sound of rain that had changed its register again. Heavier now, slower drops, the kind that settles in for the day. Her phone showed 2 missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize, a text from Dara that said, "Call me when you can." "I have 18 questions," and a voice message from a number that turned out to be a journalist from the Caldervane Register who had heard something was happening at Hartwell Memorial and wanted a comment. She deleted the voicemail without responding and texted Crow's number. Journalist from local paper called me. What's your guidance? The reply came back in 4 minutes. Refer all media to the State Oversight Office Public Affairs line. Do not confirm or comment on anything. This is for your protection. She showered and changed and was making coffee when Gabe arrived at 4:12 p.m. with a duffel bag and the expression of a man who had driven 2 hours running scenarios. He hugged her, which she let happen for longer than she usually would, and then he sat at her kitchen table and she told him everything in the efficient, linear way she explained things, and he listened without interrupting, which was a quality she valued in him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. 7 facilities, he said. That's what Farrow thinks. The investigators haven't confirmed a number. And the people running this network are currently watching what happens here and managing their response. Yes. He looked at the table. You don't seem scared. I'm tired, she said. Tired moves differently than scared. He nodded slowly. What do you need? I need you to be here. I need to not think about this for approximately 8 hours. She stopped. I need to know that what I did today was the right call, and I need someone who isn't a federal investigator or a retired colonel to tell me that. Gabe looked at her steadily. You found $2.5 million stolen from an emergency room, and you reported it, and they arrested him. Of course it was the right call. It might pull in 6 other hospitals. It might cost people their jobs. People who might not have been directly involved, but who are adjacent. The process is going to take months. Garvin has lawyers who will fight every piece of it. Yeah, Gabe said. And? She almost laughed. It wasn't funny exactly, but there was something in its bluntness that cut through the noise of the day. And nothing, she said. You're right. He got up and opened her refrigerator and looked at it. You have no food. I've had a busy month. I'll order something. He pulled out his phone. Sit down and stop doing that thing where you're still solving it in your head. She sat. Passing. The next morning arrived gray and dry. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn and left the streets with a washed, flat look that felt appropriate. Mara was at the kitchen table with coffee before 7 because she had slept hard and dreamlessly and woken with the particular alertness of a body that had finally processed its debt. Crow called it 8:03. I want to update you on where things stand, she said, without preamble. Garvin's arraignment was yesterday afternoon. Charges include fraud, embezzlement, obstruction, and falsifying financial records. He entered a not guilty plea, which is standard. Bail was set and denied on the basis of financial complexity and flight risk. He stays in custody through the preliminary proceedings. And Birch? Cooperating, significantly. A pause. More than we expected, frankly. He's been in an interview room for most of the past 18 hours. His attorney negotiated a cooperation arrangement this morning. What does that mean for the scope? It means we have names we didn't have yesterday. The holding structure, the 7-entity network Farrow would have mentioned to you. We now have identified contacts in 3 of the 7 affiliated facilities. 2 of those contacts are currently being approached by regional investigative offices. The 3rd is more complicated. She stopped. This is where I need to be careful about what I share with you over the phone. Mara understood. There's someone in the network who's more protected. Let's say there's a component of this that involves a set of relationships we're currently being very deliberate about before we move. Her voice had shifted slightly, still controlled, but carrying a density it hadn't before. What I can tell you is that the scope of this has grown beyond what a single state office manages. We've had a coordination call this morning with federal assets that have been looking at the holding structure from a DoD procurement angle. Farrow's people. The military contracts, Mara said, among other things. Crow paused. Miss Voss, I want to give you a realistic picture. This is going to become a considerably larger and more public proceeding than a single hospital fraud case, which means the media attention is going to increase, which means your name is going to come out. It may already be moving in local press. You'll want legal counsel that specializes in whistleblower protection, not just general employment law. I can give you a referral if you want it. Please. I'll text you a name. Another pause, shorter. How are you doing? My brother's here. I slept. Good. And then, in a different register, quieter. For what it's worth, the 7-month investigation we'd been running had hit a wall about 3 weeks ago. The document trail we were working from was solid, but had a gap we couldn't bridge. Your submission closed that gap. I want you to understand that. Mara held the phone and looked out her kitchen window at the gray street below. What was the gap? The original contract document for Meridian Supply Partners, the one that shows Garvin's personal signature authorizing the first payment. We couldn't locate it. The hospital's record showed it had been executed, but the physical document was missing and the digital version had been deleted from the system well before we started looking. It's in my files, Mara said. A silence. Excuse me. I photographed it 14 months ago. It was in the procurement archive before the digital purge. I have it on the USB drive and in my encrypted backup. She paused. I sent it as part of the initial submission last night. Another silence. Longer. Ms. Voss, Crow said slowly, that document is the foundational link between Garvin personally and the first fraudulent transaction. With that, the structure of the entire case changes. I know what it is, she said. It was the first thing I found. The referral Crow sent was an attorney named Sylvia Haast, who had offices in Caldervane's financial district and whose website described a practice focused on healthcare regulatory law and whistleblower proceedings. Mara called the number at 9:30 and got an assistant who said Ms. Haast had been expecting her call. That detail, expecting her call, told Mara that Crow had already spoken to Haast before texting her the number, which told her that the investigators were moving faster on the protective side of this than she had anticipated, which told her, in turn, that their assessment of her exposure was not casual. Haast herself came on the line within 2 minutes. She had a direct, economical manner, and she spent exactly as long on pleasantries as was necessary to establish a human baseline, and not 1 second longer, which Mara found immediately reassuring. I've been briefed generally on the situation, Haast said. I want to be straightforward with you. Based on what I've been told, the whistleblower statute protection here is strong. The retaliatory termination is going to be a clean case. What's more complex is managing your position as the situation expands beyond the original filing. Meaning the network, Mara said. Marapam. Meaning that you're currently the primary documented source for a case that may involve multiple institutions, potential federal charges, and actors who have significant resources available for legal response. That's not a threat assessment. I'm not in a position to make those. What it means legally is that we need to establish a very clear, very clean record of everything you did and when you did it, so that no one can subsequently characterize your documentation as anything other than what it is. I've been keeping a log, Mara said. Every action I took, time-stamped, with the rationale. Of course you have. Haast said it without condescension. It was the same way Crow had said, I know you are, when Mara had told her she was calm. The tone of someone who had looked at the file and had already adjusted their expectations upward. Can you come to my office today? 2 o'clock? 2 o'clock. She got there at 1:53, which was just like her, and spent 90 minutes with Haast going through the documentation set in a way that was more methodical and more specific than anything she'd done in the conference room with Crow. Haast had an associate present who took notes on a laptop and asked sharp follow-up questions about timestamps and access logs. By the time they finished, Mara's coffee had gone cold, and the light through the office windows had shifted to early afternoon. You're in a strong position, Haast said, gathering the document set. Procedurally. I want to be honest that the road ahead is not short. But you built this correctly. You used the right channels first, you preserved the right evidence, and you filed before you were terminated, which is crucial. She looked at Mara over the edge of her reading glasses. Whoever fired you this morning made a very significant legal error. I know, Mara said. They knew I'd reported and they fired me anyway. Yes, that's going to matter. Haast paused. One more thing. The journalist who called you, I didn't respond. Good. Don't. At some point in the next 72 hours, this story is likely going to break publicly in some form, and when it does, your name is going to be attached to it. When that happens, you direct everything to me and say nothing independently, even if what you would say is accurate and appropriate, especially then. Understood. She took the elevator down and walked back to her car in the thin afternoon light. Her phone had 3 more notifications from numbers she didn't recognize. She ignored them all and drove home. Gabe had gone out for groceries and come back and made something with pasta and too much garlic that she ate 2 plates of because she hadn't eaten a real meal in 30 hours. They sat at the table after and drank coffee, and he told her something mildly absurd about a commercial job he'd finished in Thornwick last week, and she laughed at the part she was supposed to laugh at, and for approximately 45 minutes the whole thing receded to a manageable distance. Her phone buzzed at 7:22 p.m. "Crow," she answered. "We have a situation," Crow said, and her voice had changed. The operational precision was still there, but something underneath it had tightened. 20 minutes ago, our team at the affiliated facility in Westmark, that's facility number 3 in the network, received a report from a staff member inside that administrative access to their financial server had been attempted repeatedly over the past hour. Someone is trying to execute a deletion similar to what happened at Hartwell. Mara stood up from the table. "Are they in time?" "We have a team in transit. They're 12 minutes out." A sound in the background. Voices, something being moved. "The reason I'm calling you is that the access attempts are coming from a device whose network profile matches the session that accessed Hartwell's cloud backup 2 nights ago. The VPN user. Yes, the same actor is active right now, trying to clean a second facility before we secure it." She paused. "Ms. Voss, the individual overseeing the network's information security, the person coordinating document destruction across multiple facilities, we have now triangulated their location to within a geographic range. They're in Caldervane." Mara went very still. "They're in this city right now." "We believe so. The VPN endpoint resolves to a commercial address that covers roughly a 12-block radius downtown." Crow's voice was precise, controlled. "I'm not telling you this to alarm you. I'm telling you because you need to know that the perimeter of this situation is closer to you geographically than we had initially assessed." Gabe was watching her from across the table with an expression that had lost any trace of the earlier lightness. "What do I do?" she said. "Stay inside. Your building has a locked entry, correct?" "Yes." "Stay there. Don't open your door to anyone you don't know. If anything feels wrong, call 911 first and then call me." A pause. "We are moving on this. We have resources in Caldervane and we are actively moving." "Okay," Mara said. "I need to go," Crow said. "I'll call you when I have more." The line went quiet. Gabe was already standing. "What happened?" "Someone connected to the network is in Caldervane. Tonight." She set her phone on the table and looked at it, and then looked at her brother. "They're trying to destroy evidence at a second hospital right now." Gabe's jaw set. "Are we in danger?" Crow doesn't think so. She thinks it's an information security operation, not... She stopped. "Not a threat," she had been about to say. But the word had a specific meaning in specific contexts, and she was suddenly not certain she was using it accurately. "The perimeter is closer than we had initially assessed." She looked at her phone. She looked at the door. She looked at the windows. Second floor, street side, not particularly exposed. Her training cataloged these things without being asked, the old instinct running underneath the surface of everything else. She crossed to the window and looked out without touching the glass. The street below was ordinary, a car moving slow, a woman with a dog. A delivery van parked at the corner with its flashers on. The van had been there when she got home. She looked at it for 3 seconds. It was a commercial delivery van, navy blue, the logo on the side for a flooring company she'd seen ads for. The flashers were on. The driver's door was closed. She had been gone for 2 hours this afternoon, and she did not specifically remember noticing it when she came back. "Gabe," she said, and something in her voice made him come to stand beside her without asking why. She looked at the van. It was possible it was nothing. It was possible this was what happened when you spent a day being told that your situation had a larger perimeter than you thought. Your pattern recognition activated on ordinary objects and asked questions about them that had ordinary answers. Then the driver's side window went down an inch, and a lens appeared in the gap. She stepped back from the window. Not fast. Fast draws attention, and she didn't know yet what she was looking at or whether she was being looked at in return. She moved the way she had learned to move in environments where being seen moving was its own kind of information. One slow step, then another, until she was far enough from the glass that the angle would make her invisible to someone sitting at street level. "Gabe," she said quietly, "go to the bathroom. Close the door. Don't turn the light on." He didn't argue. He had been in enough of her controlled voice moments over the years to know that arguing was the one response she genuinely could not use right now. He picked up his coffee cup, out of habit, the way a person tidies when they're nervous, and walked down the hall. She heard the bathroom door close with a soft click. She pressed her back against the wall beside the window and looked at the ceiling and ran through what she actually knew. A van parked at the corner. A window that had gone down an inch. A lens-shaped object in the gap. That was the complete factual inventory. Everything else was interpretation, and interpretation was where panicked people went wrong. She pulled out her phone and called Crow. 4 rings, voicemail. She texted instead. Navy van parked corner Calvert and 9th. Driver's window cracked, possible camera lens visible. Been parked since before I returned home. Advise. Then she called 911 and gave them the same information in 14 words, her name and her address, and a description of the van's plate number, which she had not consciously registered until she found herself reciting it, the way trained observation surfaces things you didn't know you'd stored. Then she stood against the wall and waited. The Caldervane PD unit arrived in 6 minutes, which was faster than she expected. She watched from the side angle of the window as the patrol car pulled up behind the van without lights. 2 officers got out and approached the driver's side, and there was a conversation she couldn't hear, and then both officers moved back and one of them spoke into his radio. Her phone buzzed. Not Crow. An unknown number. "Ms. Voss," male voice, unhurried. "I'm Officer Dale Pruitt with Caldervane PD. We have a situation with the vehicle at your corner. Can you confirm your location?" "Second floor, apartment 2C. I called it in." "Yes, ma'am. The individual in the vehicle has presented credentials identifying himself as a private investigator licensed in this state. He's declined to state who retained him." A pause. "He has a camera with a telephoto lens consistent with your description. We can't compel him to leave based on that alone. He's on public street." She processed this. "Has he been photographing my apartment?" "He states he was conducting a general surveillance. We've documented his credentials and plates, and we're running him now." "Thank you." She kept her voice flat. "Can you tell me if the name of the firm he works for is on the credentials?" A pause while Pruitt relayed the question. "The credential lists him as independent contractor, business name Aldgate Investigative Services." She wrote it down. "I appreciate you responding." "We'll stay in the area for a bit," Pruitt said. "Call back if anything changes." She ended the call, and Gabe came out of the bathroom before she'd gotten to the kitchen. "What was that?" "Private investigator in the van, photographing the apartment." She looked at the name she'd written. Aldgate Investigative Services. "Someone hired surveillance on me, tonight. The same night the investigators are trying to secure a second facility." Gabe's expression moved through anger and arrived somewhere colder. "What does that mean?" "It means someone wanted to know where I am and what I'm doing. Whether I'm making calls, whether I have visitors, whether I'm holding documents they haven't accounted for." She looked at her notes. "It's not a physical threat. It's an information operation. Someone in this network is trying to assess their exposure through me." She texted Crow again. "Also, private investigator in van, credentials for Aldgate Investigative Services. Appears to be conducting surveillance on my apartment. CPD has documented." Crow called back in 90 seconds. "Aldgate," she said, no greeting. "How long was the van there?" "Based on my return time and the van's position, at least 2 hours, possibly more." "Did the PI have audio equipment?" "I don't know. CPD can tell you." A sound on Crow's end. Movement. A door. "We ran Aldgate 6 months ago when a witness in a separate financial case flagged them. They operate in a gray zone, legitimate PI license, but the client list has overlap with corporate legal teams that represent financial sector defendants." She paused. "Someone lawyered up very quickly and hired eyes on you. Garvin is in custody. Garvin is one node." Crow said it with a precision that carried more weight than her usual measured delivery. "Ms. Voss, I need to move on this. I want you to do one thing tonight. Write down every interaction, every call, every visit since your termination this morning. Timestamps, names, exact words where you remember them. Don't send it anywhere. Just create the record." "I already have most of it." "Of course you do. A beat. "I'll have someone in your building within the hour." The line went dead. The investigator Crow sent was a woman named Torres, who arrived at 9:15 p.m. wearing civilian clothes and carrying a laptop bag, and who accepted Gabe's offer of coffee with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who understood that normalizing her presence in the room was part of her function. She didn't explain much. She set up near the kitchen table with a sightline to the front door and the window, and she worked on her laptop and was unobtrusive in the particular deliberate way of someone trained to be. The Navy van was gone. CPD had sat at the corner long enough to make its continued presence conspicuous, and eventually the PI had driven away. She didn't know where. She suspected it didn't matter. Whoever had hired him had what they needed from the session or had received enough signal from the PD response to pull back and regroup. She sat at her desk in the bedroom and wrote the timeline Crow had asked for, which took her 40 minutes and resulted in 3 typed pages, and the particular sensation of having turned something external into something documented and therefore manageable. It was the same impulse that had driven her to keep a log 14 months ago. The act of writing things down didn't change what they were, but it changed the relationship between you and them, moved them from the space where they could expand unchecked to the space where they had edges and a sequence and could be reviewed. When she finished, she closed the laptop and looked at the wall. She thought about the Westmark facility. Crow's team had been 12 minutes out when she called. That was 40 minutes ago. She didn't know what they had found. She went back to the kitchen and poured coffee she didn't need and stood by the counter. "They get there in time?" Gabe asked. He was reading something on his phone with the forced focus of a man trying to give his hands something to do. "I don't know yet." Torres looked up from her laptop. Westmark team secured the server at 7:49. Deletion attempt was interrupted. She said it simply, without drama, and went back to her screen. Mara absorbed this. The deletion had been interrupted, which meant the documents were intact, which meant whoever had been trying to clean the second facility had failed in exactly the way they had failed at Hartwell. Not all the way through, not cleanly enough to eliminate the trail. The same pattern, repeated under pressure, under a time constraint they couldn't control, producing the same incomplete result. "Did they identify the person who was making the attempt?" she asked Torres. Torres kept her eyes on her screen. "Above my visibility." It was an honest answer and a complete one, and Mara didn't push it. She slept again. Not easily. The sleep of someone who had run the same calculations too many times and whose brain was trying to load them again before it shut down. But she slept, and when she woke at 6 the next morning, Torres was gone, and there was a note on the kitchen table in a tight, economical hand. "Shift change at 0500. Replacement is outside in a gray Civic. Call Crow at 8. Gabe was still asleep. She made coffee and stood at the window, far enough back to be invisible from the street, and looked at the gray morning. The Civic was where Torres had said it would be. The corner where the van had been was empty. Ordinary morning traffic. She called Crow at exactly 8 o'clock. "I have a significant update," Crow said. She sounded like someone who had been awake for most of the night and had processed it to the point where the tiredness was just weather. Birch's cooperation expanded overnight. He gave us 3 names we didn't have, individuals within the holding structure's management layer who were responsible for financial operations across the network. 2 of them are attorneys at a private firm in the city. The third is a former state healthcare board official. Mara set down her coffee cup. A board official. Former, retired 14 months ago. His involvement predates the board service. He was part of building the original network structure before he took the public position, and the network continued operating with his coordination during and after his tenure. Crow paused. "His name is Gordon Price. Does that mean anything to you?" She ran it through everything she had, all 14 months of documentation, every name she'd cross-referenced, every signatory on every document she'd photographed. "No," she said, "I've never seen that name." "You wouldn't have. He was careful not to leave paper in the facilities. His function was coordination and protection, making sure the network's operations stayed below the threshold that would trigger regulatory attention." A pause. "He is also, based on Birch's account, the person who first approached Garvin 7 years ago with the structure. Garvin didn't build this. He was recruited into it. She absorbed this. How far up does it go? We don't know yet. Price's connections to the board gave him access to information about investigation priorities and regulatory focus areas that the network used to time its operations. That's the part we're still working through. Crow's voice shifted fractionally. What I can tell you is that Price was contacted last night. He has retained counsel, and he is not cooperating. His attorney issued a statement this morning that his client categorically denies any involvement and that any allegations are the result of a flawed investigation built on improperly obtained documentation. The last sentence landed with a weight she recognized immediately. They're going after my documentation, she said. They're asserting that your access to procurement records exceeded your authorization and that documents obtained through those accesses are inadmissible. It's a procedural argument, not a factual one, but it will require response. Crow's tone was steady. Haast will address this. It's not new territory for this kind of case, and the statute is clear on whistleblower document protection. But you should know it's coming. How does it affect the original documents, the cloud backup? It doesn't. The backup was accessed under subpoena. The bank transfer records were obtained independently. Birch's testimony is independent. The foundational contract document you provided, Garvin's original signature on the Meridian authorization, has been authenticated by a forensic documents examiner as of last night. She paused. Price's attorneys are trying to knock out the periphery to make the center look weaker. They won't succeed, but the process will take time. And the PI who was watching my apartment, we've traced the payment for that engagement. It went through a legal services billing account at the firm where two of Price's associates practice. She let that sit. So, yes, the surveillance on you last night was funded through the same network that built the fraud. She spent the morning with Haast on a video call that ran 90 minutes and covered the procedural challenge to her documentation in detail that was both necessary and exhausting. Haast was precise and unhurried and had clearly reviewed the overnight developments before they spoke, because she had positions ready for questions Mara hadn't asked yet. By the end of the call, Mara understood three things clearly. Her documentation was legally protected under the statute. The challenge would delay but not derail the proceedings, and her role in the coming weeks would require her to be publicly identified in a way she had been quietly dreading. When it breaks in the press, Haas said, near the end, it will break large. This is not a local corruption story anymore. The board connection makes it a state governance story. You should be prepared for that. I'm not interested in being public. I know. But the story will tell itself. And when it does, your name will be in it whether you comment or not. The question is whether we shape the context of your role or let others do it. Haas looked at her through the camera. You were terminated for reporting misconduct. You're a decorated veteran with 14 months of careful documentation. You're not the character in this story that anyone can make the villain. We let that be known, clearly, and once, and then we let the legal process run. Mara thought about it. One statement. I draft it, you review it, we release it through my office. No interviews, no follow-up. Okay. After the call ended, she sat at her desk for a moment and then went to find Gabe, who was in the kitchen eating cereal he'd found in the back of her cupboard and reading something on his tablet. I'm going to be in the news, she said. He looked up. Yeah, I figured. You don't have to stay. He set the tablet down. I'm going to stay until you stop looking like someone who hasn't slept in a week. Then I'll go. He picked the tablet back up. That's probably another 4 days at minimum. She almost smiled. It wasn't quite there yet, but it was closer than it had been yesterday. The story broke at 2:17 p.m., not in the Caldervane register, but in a state wire service that had picked up the arraignment filings and connected them to the overnight activity at the Westmark facility. By 3:30, 2 regional television stations had live coverage in front of Hartwell Memorial. By 5, a national healthcare news outlet had published a piece naming the holding structure and its connections to the former board official. Gordon Price's name was in every version of the story. Mara watched the coverage from her apartment with Torres's replacement, a quiet man named Egan, who had coffee and said very little, and felt the strange doubled sensation of watching something she had spent 14 months building become a thing that existed outside of her. It had its own shape now, its own momentum. It no longer needed her to push it. The piece that bothered her most was a segment on the evening news where the anchor referenced an unnamed source at Hartwell Memorial who described the investigation as moving too fast and suggested the documentation might have been assembled selectively. She knew the phrasing. It had the fingerprints of Price's legal team on it, the same vocabulary as the procedural challenge, filtered through an unnamed source into a news cycle. She texted Haast a screenshot. Haast replied in 4 minutes. Noted. This is anticipated. Our statement goes out tomorrow morning at 9. Sit tight. She set down her phone and looked at Egan. Is this normal? The media management piece? Egan didn't look up from his own work. In cases with political adjacency, yes. A pause. The unnamed source strategy is usually a sign they don't have a factual counterargument. She accepted this and went to the kitchen and made dinner, pasta again, because Gabe had stocked the pantry with the items he knew how to cook and the items she would actually eat, which had significant overlap. They ate at the kitchen table and talked about nothing important, which was a skill she had come to appreciate about her brother, his ability to locate the ordinary thing in the available space and speak about it without pretense. At 8:44 p.m., her phone showed a call from Crow. Price was taken in for questioning this afternoon, Crow said. He declined to answer questions on the advice of counsel, which is his right, and was released pending further proceedings. But in the course of executing a search warrant at his residence, our team found something. She paused, and the pause had a specific texture. A paper file, physical documents, not digital. Not. A folder containing correspondence between Price and Garvin dating back 9 years, before the Meridian vendor structure was formalized. The correspondence documents the initial recruitment conversation, the terms of the arrangement, and references to 2 individuals at other network facilities who were brought in through the same process. Mara gripped the phone. You have the original recruitment correspondence. Handwritten notes from Garvin, typed letters from Price, and 3 printed emails from a shared account that both men had access to. Crow's voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not satisfaction exactly, but the sound of a case that had just finished closing its last open question. Price kept records. We don't know why, possibly as leverage, possibly out of habit. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we now have, in Price's own documents, evidence that he built this network, recruited Garvin into it, and maintained operational oversight for 9 years. His own attorneys can't challenge those documents, Mara said. They came from his residence under warrant. Correct. And they corroborate everything in your file and everything Birch said. A pause. Ms. Voss, I want to tell you something clearly. The case against the full network is now built, not completed. There are proceedings ahead, and they will take time, and it will not always be comfortable. But the evidentiary foundation is closed. No one is going to knock this down. She sat with this for a moment. The kitchen was quiet. The pasta pot was on the stove. Gabe was washing dishes with the unself-conscious focus of a person doing a small thing that needed doing. Egan was at his post near the door. When does it move to formal charges, she said. Price's attorneys are requesting a delay, which is standard. We'll oppose it. My estimate is 72 hours before we see an indictment on the expanded charge set. Garvin's counsel has already indicated they're exploring a cooperation arrangement, which tells you everything you need to know about how they assess their client's position. Garvin's going to cooperate against Price. That appears to be where it's heading. A pause. Which, incidentally, is an outcome your documentation made possible. Without the foundational contract you provided, Garvin's cooperation would have less evidentiary value. But with it, his testimony becomes confirmation of a record rather than an unsubstantiated account. She looked at the ceiling. What happens at Hartwell? The board? The staff? The board has been in emergency session since this afternoon. You'll hear from them. Crow said it with a specificity that told Mara it was not a general prediction. I've been in contact with their counsel. What they do next is their decision, but they've been made aware of the legal landscape. And the medical staff who refused to back me? A pause. That's not within my jurisdiction. Not cold, just accurate. What they do with that is between them and whoever they are. The board's contact came the next morning in the form of a letter delivered to Haast's office by courier at 10:15 a.m. Haast called her as soon as she had read it. They want to meet, Haast said. Board chair and 2 members plus legal counsel. They've proposed tomorrow afternoon. What do they want to discuss? The letter uses the phrase remediation and path forward, which in board language means they want to manage what's coming and they've identified you as the party they need to address to do that. Hust paused. My read is they're scared, which is the correct emotional response to their situation. I'll be present throughout. What do I want from this meeting? That's what we need to talk through. Hust's voice had its usual economy. What do you actually want, Ms. Voss? Not strategically, actually. She thought about it. Not the legal position, not the whistleblower statute, not the procedural optimal outcome. What she actually wanted. She let herself think it through honestly, which took longer than she expected. I want the emergency department to be funded correctly, she said finally. I want the stolen money recovered and put back into patient care. I want the staff who were working in good faith while this was happening to not be collateral damage in the proceedings. She paused, and I want it on record that I didn't do anything wrong. All of that is achievable, Hast said. The first three require board commitment, which we can document. The last one is already in the record. But you're right to name it. Another pause. Is there anything personal you want from them? She thought about Garvin standing in his office with the rain outside the windows, the termination notice folded on the desk, the lawyer who billed by the quarter hour. She thought about Dale Birch with his prepared statement. She thought about the doctors who had not looked at her in the corridor as she walked out. An apology means something when it comes from someone who understood what they were doing, she said. It doesn't mean anything from someone who's apologizing to manage their legal exposure. I know the difference. I don't need the version that's being offered right now. Hust was quiet for a moment. That's a mature position. It's a tired one, Mara said. That's not the same thing. The board meeting happened at 3 o'clock the following afternoon in a conference room at a downtown law firm that was neutral territory for both parties. The board chair was a woman named Irene Mallory, 60-something, who'd been on the board for 11 years and who carried herself with the disciplined poise of someone who had spent a career managing the distance between what institutions needed to say and what was actually true. She sat across from Mara with her hands flat on the table and spoke without notes. On behalf of the board of Hartwell Memorial, she began, I want to acknowledge, Ms. Mallory, Haas said pleasantly. Before we go to statements, I'd like to establish what we're here to accomplish. We're not here for an oral acknowledgement. We're here to discuss concrete remediation. So let's start there and work backward to the language. Mallory's expression adjusted. She looked at her own attorney, who gave a small nod. All right, she said. What are you asking for? Haas set a document on the table. Reinstatement with full back pay calculated from the date of termination. Written acknowledgement that the termination was retaliatory and without cause. A commitment to independent financial oversight of the emergency department operating budget for a minimum of 3 years. And a documented allocation of the recovered funds, once the legal proceedings return them, to emergency care operations. Mallory looked at the document. Reinstatement to what position? That's open, Hast said. Ms. Voss's previous position, or a role commensurate with her experience in what's been demonstrated here. The board can make an offer. Mallory looked at Mara directly for the first time since they'd sat down. There was something in it that wasn't exactly guilt, but was adjacent to it. The look of someone taking an accurate inventory of a situation they had failed to prevent. We'd like to propose Director of Emergency Nursing Compliance, Mallory said. A new position, overseeing the transparency measures that will be required under the oversight agreement. She paused. It carries department head standing. Mara looked at Hast. We'll review the position description before any agreement, Hast said, but that's a reasonable starting point. The meeting lasted another 2 hours. It was not smooth. There were 3 points where the board's attorney pushed back hard on language, and Hast pushed back harder with statute citations. And there was one exchange over the fund allocation timeline that lasted 20 minutes and ended with a number that was lower than Hast had asked for and higher than the board had offered, and which Mara had accepted not because it was perfect, but because it was real, and it was now, and waiting for perfect was how nothing got done. By the time she walked out of the building at 5:30 into the clear cold of a Caldervane evening that had finally shed the rain, she had a signed term sheet in Hast's briefcase and 3 pages of documented commitments from the board of Hartwell Memorial Hospital. She stood on the sidewalk outside the law firm and called Farrow. He picked up on the second ring. Ms. Voss. It's moving, she said. The board, the charges, all of it. I know, he said. I've been watching. A pause. A car passed on the street. The evening light was doing something precise and clean to the buildings across the way, the kind of late light that makes cities look like they were designed. Is the DOD side of this going to complicate the civil proceedings? She asked. A pause that was different from his usual pauses, shorter, with an edge to it. Why do you ask? Because Crow said there are relationships in the network she's being very deliberate about before moving. And I've been thinking about what that means in terms of the timeline. Farrow was quiet for 4 seconds. There's one element of the network that involves contracted work that ran through federal medical logistics channels before Price moved it to the shell structure. The individuals associated with that element are cooperating separately through a different process. Another pause. There is one name you haven't heard yet, a name that was above Price in the original construction of the arrangement. She stopped walking. Above Price. We believe so. The correspondence found in his residence references a third party only by initials in a way that Birch's account partially corroborates. His voice had gone very careful. The investigators are moving toward that identification, but I want you to understand that when they get there, the case will look different than it does right now, bigger, more public, more... He stopped, looking for the word. More contested. What are the initials? She said. A pause so long she thought the call had dropped. RW, Farrow said. She ran it through everything she had, every document, every name, every signatory, every reference in the Hartwell procurement system. She had been through that file so many times the details existed in her memory like a map with every landmark placed. And then, slowly, with the particular sensation of a thing that had always been visible that she had never looked at directly, she placed it. 14 months ago, at the very beginning of her documentation, she had found a single procurement authorization with an unfamiliar countersignature on a document that was supposed to require only one signature. She had noted it in her log and set it aside as an anomaly she couldn't explain. The countersignature was a set of initials rather than a full name, which was irregular but not unheard of in the hospital's older paperwork systems. The initials were RW. She had a photograph of that document on her USB drive. She had included it in her submission to the Oversight Office along with 200 other documents, categorized under a folder she had labeled Irregular Authorization, Origin Unknown. Farrow, she said slowly, I have a document with those initials. The silence on his end lasted 3 full seconds before he spoke. Tell me exactly what you have, he said. She told him everything about the document in exactly the order she remembered finding it, the date she had first photographed it, 14 months ago, a Tuesday, late afternoon, the procurement archive room on the basement level where the paper records from the hospital's pre-digitization era were still kept in labeled banker's boxes that no one had gotten around to scanning. She had been there looking for the original Meridian contract and had found instead a thinner folder misfiled 2 boxes to the right of where it should have been, containing 4 documents that didn't belong to the category on the box label. 3 of them had been ordinary procurement forms with minor irregularities she had already logged. The 4th was a vendor authorization letter from 8 years ago, older than anything else she had found, countersigned at the bottom in a handwriting that was different from Garvin's, initialed rather than signed in full, next to a title line that read simply Regional Oversight Coordination. She had photographed it because it was irregular. She had filed it under Irregular Authorization, Origin Unknown, because she couldn't place it. She had not gone back to it because at the time she had more immediate evidence to pursue, and the document was 8 years old, and she had thought of it as background rather than foundation. Farrow listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for 6 seconds. The title on the counter-signature line, he said, Regional Oversight Coordination. That's not a Hartwell title. No, I assumed it was a vendor-side designation, someone authorizing on behalf of the supplier. It's not. His voice was careful in the way of someone carrying a weight they've been carrying for a while and have decided to set down. That title was used informally within the DoD medical logistics program I referenced. It was a coordination role, someone responsible for managing the interface between the federal supply contracts and the regional hospital procurement networks. The role was never formally documented because it was never formal. It existed to keep the arrangement running without creating a paper trail that could be traced back to the federal side. She stood very still on the sidewalk. The evening traffic moved past her and the cold was getting into her collar and she didn't move. RW was the federal liaison, she said. We believe so. We've believed so for 3 months. What we haven't had is a document that places those initials at the point of origin, at an actual transaction, in actual handwriting, at the time the network was being built. He paused. You have that document. It's in the submission I filed 10 days ago, in the folder labeled Irregular Authorization. Crow's team will have it. They may not have identified its significance yet. 10 days is fast for a document set that large. Another pause. Ms. Voss, I need you to call Crow tonight and tell her exactly what you told me. The folder name, the document date, the title on the counter-signature line. Don't wait until morning. Who is RW? She said. Farrow exhaled slowly, and in the exhale she heard the particular tiredness of someone who had been watching something go wrong for a long time before anyone withstanding to stop it was in position to do so. His name is Raymond Weld, he said. He retired from a federal contracting oversight position 4 years ago. He currently sits on the board of 2 private healthcare investment firms and consults for a third. A pause. He is 63 years old, well-connected, and has spent 4 years believing he was clean because the paper trail stopped at Price. It doesn't stop at Price, she said. No, Farrow said. It stops at a misfiled folder in a procurement archive that no one thought to look in. He let that sit. Call Crow. She called Crow. Iman. Crow answered in 2 rings and listened without speaking while Mara described the document. Then she said, Hold on. And the line went quiet, not dead, just set aside. And Mara could hear the background sounds of a working office. Keyboards, a door, someone's voice in a register too low to parse. She stood on the sidewalk and waited and watched a city bus pull away from the stop across the street with the heavy deliberateness of something that had a schedule to keep regardless of what else was happening. Crow came back on after 4 minutes. We have the document, she said. It's been in the queue for secondary review. I'm looking at the scan right now. A pause. The handwriting on the counter signature. We're going to need a forensic comparison. That takes time. How much time? Expedited with the right examiner 48 hours. Another pause, shorter. Ms. Voss, if this comparison confirms what we think it confirms, Raymond Weld is no longer a person of interest in a secondary investigation. He becomes a primary defendant in a federal case. She stopped. You understand what that means in terms of what happens next. It gets louder, Mara said, significantly. And the network, the 7 facilities, the holding structure, all of it, traces back to him. If the handwriting confirms it, yes. The origination point of the entire arrangement was Weld. Price built the operational structure. Garvin ran 1 node. But the person who designed the financial architecture and provided the federal side protection that kept it running for 9 years is Weld. Her voice had the specific steadiness of someone who had worked a long case and was standing at the edge of its completion and was not allowing herself to feel it yet because there were still steps between here and there. We've been trying to get to him for 3 months. You had the document for 10 days. We had 4,300 documents for 10 days. We would have gotten to it. You got us there faster. A beat. I'm sending you a secured document uploader. I need the original photograph from your drive, full resolution, tonight. I'll have it to you within the hour. She walked back to her building, took the elevator up, and sat at her desk with the USB drive and her laptop and found the photograph in 12 minutes. She knew approximately where it was because she had built her own filing system and had used it consistently, which was one of those unglamorous habits that turned out to matter enormously, and uploaded it through the secure link Crow had sent. She sent the confirmation text and then sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. Gabe appeared in the doorway. Food? Not yet. She looked at him. I found the piece that connects the whole thing. A document I photographed 14 months ago that I didn't know was the origin point. He leaned in the doorway. Is that good? It's the difference between prosecuting a fraud operation and prosecuting the person who built it. She paused. Yeah, it's good. He nodded slowly. Okay. He went back to the kitchen. She heard him opening cabinet doors. The particular sequence of someone who had decided that feeding people was the thing he could actually do. She sat at her desk and thought about the procurement archive room in Hartwell's basement, the banker's boxes, the misfiled folder 2 positions to the right. She thought about the Tuesday afternoon 14 months ago when she had been looking for one thing and found another, and had almost set it aside, and had taken the photograph because it was irregular, and she was the kind of person who documented irregular things even when she didn't know why they mattered yet. She thought about all the ways this could have gone differently if she hadn't photographed that specific document, if she had filed the compliance report and then stopped, the way the system implicitly expected you to, if she had accepted Birch's non-response as a closed door and moved on, if she had not called Pharaoh. The thing about the spaces between right and wrong is that they're not always visible until after you've crossed them. You make the next correct decision with the information you have, and you keep moving, and you don't know, while you're doing it, whether it will matter. You find out later, sometimes much later, sometimes in a parking lot in the rain, sometimes in a basement archive room, sometimes on a sidewalk in the cold, while a man whose name you've been tracking for months turns out to be written in your own files. Petit C. The forensic handwriting comparison came back in 31 hours. Crow called her at 9:47 a.m., 2 days after the document upload, and she answered from her kitchen where she had been making actual breakfast, eggs, which Gabe had bought along with approximately 30 other things that had transformed her refrigerator from a philosophical statement about avoidance into something resembling a functional food supply. The comparison is confirmed, Crow said. The countersignature on the document you provided matches a handwriting sample obtained from Raymond Weld's federal contracting records. The match confidence is 94%, which is well above the threshold for evidentiary use. She stopped. We have an indictment on Weld. It was sealed this morning. Service is being executed today. Mara set down her spatula. Today, she said. As of approximately 40 minutes ago, Raymond Weld is in federal custody. Crow's voice had something in it now, not triumph, but a kind of settled finality, the sound of a door closing on something that had been standing open too long. The indictment carries charges of federal contract fraud, conspiracy to commit financial crimes across state lines, obstruction of federal regulatory oversight, and coordinated embezzlement across 6 healthcare facilities in 2 states. 6, Mara said. The Westmark facility made 6. Yes. The 7th held structure entity turned out to be a dormant vehicle that was never activated, possibly intended for expansion that was never executed. A pause. The total estimated theft across all 6 facilities, accounting for the recovered documentation, is $17.4 million over 9 years. She sat down at the kitchen table. $17.4 million. Taken from emergency care funds, from trauma response budgets, from the operating margins of hospitals that served people who had nowhere else to go. Taken carefully and slowly over 9 years by people who understood the systems well enough to work inside them and who had calculated, correctly, that no one would look closely enough, long enough, to find the pattern. Almost no one. What happens to Garvin's cooperation arrangement now? She asked. It proceeds. His testimony against Price and Weld is still valuable. He was present at conversations that no document records. His sentencing recommendation will reflect the cooperation. Crow paused. He will still be convicted. The arrangement affects the sentencing, not the outcome. And Price? Price's attorneys reversed their non-cooperation position within 2 hours of the Weld indictment. He's now in discussions. A dry note entered her voice. People's willingness to talk increases substantially when they realize the person above them is no longer in a position to provide protection. What are they looking at, in terms of sentences? Crow went through it with the careful precision of someone who understood that specificity mattered, and that vague justice was not the same as actual justice. Garvin. Federal fraud and embezzlement, expected sentencing range of 8 to 12 years with cooperation credit, permanent prohibition from any healthcare administrative role, personal liability for restitution. Price. Conspiracy and fraud charges across multiple jurisdictions, no cooperation credit, expected range of 15 to 20 years, full asset forfeiture on accounts connected to the holding structure. Weld federal charges with the additional weight of abusing a government-adjacent position, the longest exposure of the 3, with prosecutors pursuing the top of the sentencing guidelines. Dale Birch, cooperation agreement executed, expected 18 months with significant time reduction for the quality of his testimony, license suspension by the State Compliance Board, permanent bar from healthcare compliance roles. The two attorneys from Price's firm who had funded the surveillance operation, disbarment proceedings initiated by the State Bar Association, criminal referrals for obstruction, and witness intimidation pending review. Perry Aldis, the IT contractor, cooperating witness, no charges anticipated. The administrative accounting staff at Hartwell, 2 individuals facing state-level fraud charges, 2 others cleared as non-participants who had processed documents without knowledge of their fraudulent nature. Mara listened to all of it. She didn't write it down. She didn't need to. It was going into the record that existed independently of her. But she listened to each name and each outcome and let it land where it was supposed to land. When Crow finished, there was a pause. "Is there anything you want to ask me?" Crow said. "The recovered funds," Mara said. "The $17.4 million. What's the recovery timeline?" "Asset forfeiture proceedings are already active on the holding structure's accounts. The Hartwell-specific allocation, approximately $2.3 million, is expected to be released to the hospital's operating accounts within 90 days pending the court's approval of the restitution order." A pause. "The board has already designated the Emergency Care Operations Fund as the primary recipient, which is consistent with your agreement. 90 days. Not immediate. Not clean. Nothing was clean at the end of a real case. There were always the proceedings that stretched and the timelines that slipped and the moments where the machinery moved slower than the need. But 90 days was real. It was a date, not a promise." "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." "You built the case," Crow said. "We executed it. That's how it's supposed to work." A pause, and in it Mara heard something that was as close as Crow's register allowed to warmth. "Take care of yourself." The call ended and Gabe was standing in the kitchen doorway with a plate of eggs he'd finished making while she was on the phone. "Well," he said. "It's done," she said. "The top of it. The person who built the whole thing is in custody." He set the plate on the table in front of her. "Eat." She ate. "Dumas." Haast's statement went out the following morning, precisely worded and 11 sentences long. It identified Mara by name as the source of the initial documentation, described the 14-month process of evidence collection in one factual paragraph, noted the whistleblower statute protection that made her termination legally indefensible, and concluded with a single sentence that Mara had approved after reading the draft 3 times. Ms. Voss acted in accordance with her professional obligations, her legal rights, and her conscience, and the outcome of this investigation reflects exactly what those things are worth when they are exercised with care. Haast had wanted a more expansive closing. Mara had said no. 11 sentences was enough. The press attention peaked and passed over the following week in the way that complex stories do when the initial dramatic arc, arrest, indictment, network revealed, gives way to the slower business of legal proceedings. The national healthcare outlet ran a longer piece that was accurate and fair and quoted Haast's statement in full. The Caldervane Register ran a front-page story that included a photograph of the hospital's exterior and a graphic showing the network's structure. Several television segments ran pieces that were less accurate, more dramatic, and which Mara watched once and did not engage with. She received, in the course of that week, 47 messages from people she didn't know: nurses, administrators, 1 emergency room physician in a different state, 2 medical students, a woman who had been a patient at one of the affiliated facilities, and who wrote 3 paragraphs about a billing dispute she'd been fighting for 2 years that she now understood differently. She read all of them. She did not respond to most of them, not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't have language yet for what she wanted to say back. The one she responded to was from a nursing student at a community college in a city she'd never visited, who had read the register piece and written, "I'm about to start a clinical rotation, and I don't know how to be in a place where I see something wrong. How did you know it was worth it?" She sat with that question for longer than she expected, which told her something. She wrote back, "I didn't know it was worth it. I knew it was correct. Those are different things, and for a long time the difference is the only thing you have. Keep going." She sent it and closed her laptop. The board meeting at Hartwell Memorial to formally ratify the remediation agreement and announce the new position was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the initial term sheet, and Mara drove to the hospital in clear weather. The long rain had finally given way to the kind of sharp autumn cold that made Caldervane look structured and precise, and parked in the employee lot in the northeast corner, because that was her spot, and she was coming back. The meeting itself lasted 45 minutes and was attended by the full board, hospital legal counsel, HOST, and 3 members of the senior clinical staff, including Warren Osei, who had requested to be present and whom the board had agreed to include. Irene Mallory read the remediation terms aloud from the approved document. Mara sat across the table and listened to the language she and HOST had negotiated become official record, and found that the experience was quieter than she had expected. Not anticlimactic, but settled, the way things feel when they end in proportion to how they should. When Mallory finished reading, she looked at Mara. The board acknowledges that your termination on October 14th was retaliatory, without proper cause, and in direct violation of the state whistleblower protection statute, she said. That acknowledgement is entered into the official board record and will be included in the hospital's public accountability report for this fiscal year. A pause. We would like to offer you the position of Director of Emergency Nursing Compliance, effective upon your acceptance, with full reinstatement of seniority and back pay for the period of termination. The room was quiet. I accept, Mara said. Osei, across the room, let out a breath she could hear from where she was sitting. The paperwork took another 20 minutes. Host reviewed every page before Mara signed anything, which added time and was absolutely correct. When it was done, Mallory offered her hand and Mara shook it. Not warmly, because warmth required a version of this story where the board had done something differently before this point, and they hadn't, but professionally, with the acknowledgement that the agreement was real and the commitment was documented, and what came next would be measured against it. She walked out of the boardroom and into the corridor, and Osei fell into step beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. They walked the length of the administrative wing in the particular silence of 2 people who have been through something together at a distance and are recalibrating what they mean to each other now. I should have done more, he said finally. It wasn't an apology dressed up as something else. It was just the statement, put plainly, without cushioning. Yes, she said. You should have. She paused. You submitted the audit request. 40 minutes in after I argued myself into it, he glanced at her. That's not the same as having your back from the beginning. No, it's not. She stopped at the elevator bank. But you did it. That matters. She pressed the button. I'm not interested in a performance of guilt from anyone in this building. I am interested in what the next year looks like. The compliance framework, the budget oversight, the reporting structures. That's where I'm going to need people who actually do things when it matters. He nodded once, slowly. I'll be there. Good. The elevator opened. She stepped in, and as the doors closed, she saw him still standing in the corridor, hands in the pockets of his white coat, the expression of a man who had made a decision and was going to carry it. She went to the emergency department before she left the building. Not for any procedural reason. The paperwork was done, the agreement was signed. She didn't start officially until the following Monday. She went because she had been away from it for 23 days and because the emergency department was where the work actually lived, and she needed to stand in it for a moment before she did anything else. The ED at 4 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon was running at its usual controlled chaos. 2 traumas in progress behind the drawn curtains, a child with a broken wrist being assessed in Bay 4, the particular 3-way conversation happening at the nurse's station between the charge nurse, a resident, and a pharmacist that is the background music of every emergency department that has ever operated anywhere. The smell was the same. The sounds were the same. The particular pressure in the air of a place where the next thing is always already arriving. The charge nurse, a woman named Rosario, whom Mara had worked beside for 3 years, looked up from the station and stopped mid-sentence. Hey, Rosario said. Hey. A pause in which several things were understood without being said. You're back, Rosario said. Monday. Mara looked at the board, patient status, room assignments, the running tally of a department in motion. How's the supplies situation? Rosario made a face that was both expressive and precise. Better than last month, worse than it should be. The procurement office processed 3 backlogged equipment orders last week after whatever happened upstairs. She paused. The defibrillator in Bay 2 has been waiting for a replacement component for 4 months. I know. It's on the list. Mara looked at the board for another moment. I'll see you Monday. Yeah, Rosario said. Good. It wasn't a parade. Nobody stopped working. The resident kept talking to the pharmacist. The child in Bay 4 made a sound that was probably about the wrist. The traumas behind the curtains continued being traumas. That was exactly right. She drove home in the late afternoon with the low autumn sun cutting across the dashboard, and her window cracked because the car had gotten warm and she preferred cold air to recycled heat. Gabe had gone back to Thornwick 2 days ago. She had watched him drive away from her building with the particular mix of relief and gratitude that she recognized as what it actually felt like to love someone, as opposed to the version of it that was just proximity. He had done what he came to do. She had let him. She stopped at the corner store 2 blocks from her apartment and bought coffee and a sandwich she didn't particularly want and a newspaper, because the newspaper habit was one she'd carried from the deployment and never dropped. And she sat in her car in the store's small lot and read the section about the Weld indictment that had run that morning. It was 3 paragraphs, below the fold. The legal reporter had gotten most of the details right. One paragraph mentioned the document that had established the connection and described it as a procurement authorization letter obtained from the hospital's physical archive. It did not describe how it had been found or by whom. She had not expected it to. She folded the paper and put it on the passenger seat and looked out the windshield at the parking lot. A woman was loading groceries into a car 2 spaces over with a toddler on her hip, who was clearly negotiating toward freedom in the focused, determined way of toddlers everywhere. The woman shifted the bag to her other arm, buckled the child in with one hand in a move that suggested long practice, and closed the door with her hip. Got in, drove away. Mara sat there a moment longer. She thought about what the nursing student had asked her and the answer she'd given. I knew it was correct. And whether she had been entirely honest with that. The truth was that there had been nights in the past 14 months when correct had felt like a word that lived in a different room than the one she was sitting in. Nights when the spreadsheets blurred and the math stopped adding up cleanly, and she had sat at her kitchen table at 2 a.m, wondering whether she had built a credible case or an elaborate rationalization of her own stubbornness. Nights when she had come very close to closing the files and accepting that some things run too deep and too long to be stopped by one person with a phone camera and a personal log. She had not closed the files. Not because she was certain, but because she was not willing to be the person who had looked at it directly and turned away. That distinction between certainty and willingness was the thing she hadn't known how to explain to the nursing student because she wasn't sure she had language for it yet. Certainty is something you have before you act. Willingness is something you discover by acting. You don't know, going in, whether what you're doing will matter. You find out by doing it long enough and carefully enough and honestly enough to give it a chance to matter. She had done that. Imperfectly, with wrong turns and slow recoveries, and at least 3 moments where she had made the next decision based on incomplete information and had been, in retrospect, lucky that the incompleteness hadn't sunk her. She had done it while being tired and underpaid and not particularly recognized, and while the people who should have helped her early had stood with their hands in their pockets. And in the end, not cleanly, not smoothly, not without cost, it had mattered. $17.4 million. 6 facilities. A 9-year operation built by people who had decided that no one was paying close enough attention. Someone had been paying attention. She started the car and drove home. On her first Monday back, she arrived at Hartwell Memorial at 7:15 in the morning, which was early but not unreasonably so, and she parked in the northeast corner of the employee lot and walked through the main entrance because there was no reason anymore to use the side door. The lobby was doing its usual morning business. Volunteers at the information desk. A family waiting near the elevator with the compressed patience of people who have been in a hospital before and know how to inhabit the time. The dietary aide pushing a breakfast cart, which meant she was running a few minutes behind her usual route. Marcus was at the security desk. He looked up when she came in, and for a moment his expression did the thing it had done when she walked out 23 days ago. That complicated combination of knowing too much and not being in a position to say any of it. and then it shifted into something simpler. "Morning, Mara." "Morning, Marcus." She stopped at the desk. "I never returned your umbrella. From about a year and a half ago." He thought about it. "Rain day." "Rain day? I took it and forgot." She set a new umbrella on the desk, compact, black, nothing expensive. "Sorry it took a while." He picked it up, looked at it. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She picked up her badge from the desk, her new badge, which someone from HR had left for her with Marcus at his request, she had been told, and clipped it to her jacket. "Have a good morning." "You too," he said. She took the elevator to the administrative floor where her new office was, a smaller room than Garvin's, without the view of the skyline, with a window that faced the east parking lot and a desk that someone had recently cleaned and a computer that had been set up but not yet logged into. She logged in, set her bag down, and looked at the whiteboard on the wall, which was empty and white and waiting. She picked up a marker and wrote 3 things. Defibrillator, Bay 2. Component order, follow up today. Budget oversight framework, draft structure, Bosson, due end of week. Procurement audit calendar, set. Q4. Schedule meeting with IT. She capped the marker and looked at the list. There was a knock at the open door. She turned. A young nurse, mid-20s, the slightly too alert expression of someone who had been working here long enough to know that things were changing and not long enough to know exactly how, was standing in the doorway with a tablet and a look that was somewhere between professional and uncertain. "Director Voss, I'm Kezia Marsh. I was told I'd be reporting to you for the compliance project." "Yes," Mara gestured to the chair across the desk. "Sit down. I want to hear what you already know about the procurement process and what doesn't make sense to you about it." Kezia sat, pulled up something on her tablet, took a breath. "Honestly, most of it doesn't make sense to me. The authorization chains are good," Mara said. "That's where we start." The formal sentencing proceedings for Elliot Garvin took place 11 weeks later and were covered in a 4-paragraph brief in the State Legal Journal and a longer piece in the Healthcare Trade Press. He received 9 years in a federal correctional facility, reduced from the maximum based on cooperation credit, with a permanent bar from healthcare administration. His restitution obligation was set at the full Hartwell-specific amount, $2,340,000, to be paid from liquidated assets. Gordon Price was sentenced 6 weeks after that in a proceeding that drew more attention because of the network's scope. 18 years, no cooperation credit ultimately granted after his late-stage reversal was assessed as insufficient. Full asset forfeiture. His law license, held informally through an association with the firm, was formally revoked by the state bar. The 2 attorneys from that firm, who had funded the surveillance operation, received disbarment and 12-month sentences for obstruction. Raymond Weld's case moved through the federal system more slowly, as federal cases do, with a legal team that contested every piece of evidence and generated delays that stretched the timeline by 4 months. It did not change the outcome. The forensic handwriting confirmation held. Birch's testimony held. Garvin's testimony held. The document that Mara had photographed 14 months ago in a basement archive room on a Tuesday afternoon held. Weld was convicted on all federal counts, sentenced to 22 years, ordered to pay restitution proportional to his role in the network's origination, which was assessed as the primary liability across all 6 facilities. He was 63 years old when he was convicted and would be 85 when he reached the end of his sentence. The total recovered funds, across all 6 facilities, were distributed through a court-supervised restitution process that Mara tracked through the public docket with the same methodical attention she had applied to the original documentation. The Hartwell allocation arrived in the hospital's emergency care operating accounts on a Wednesday morning, 94 days after Crow had estimated 90. 4 days late. Still real. She was in her office when the finance director sent the confirmation email to the department heads, and she read it twice and then put her phone face down on the desk and went back to the compliance framework document she'd been editing, because there was still work to do, and the work did not pause to appreciate its own momentum. She finished the document 40 minutes later and sent it for review. Then she sat back in her chair, in her office on the administrative floor, with the east parking lot visible through her window and the whiteboard behind her covered in lists that were getting shorter as the weeks passed, and she gave herself a moment, Just one, brief and unceremonious, to sit with what it had cost and what it had returned. It had cost her a clean year of her life. It had cost her sleep in quantities she would probably never fully recover. It had cost her a certainty about institutions that she was not sure she wanted back anyway, because the version of it she'd had before was based on an incomplete picture. And incomplete pictures were how people like Weld and Garvin operated. And the gap between what an institution claimed to be and what it actually was when no one was checking carefully. She was the person who checked carefully now. That was her job, in its most fundamental form, and she had arrived at it by being the only person in a particular building on a particular morning who had looked at a number that didn't add up and refused to accept the easy explanation. That was not heroism. She was clear-eyed about that. It was stubbornness and professional habit and the accumulated weight of a career that had taught her that the difference between a patient who made it and one who didn't was often just someone paying attention at the right moment. She had paid attention. The emergency department below her had a working defibrillator in Bay 2 now. The procurement calendar was on its second quarterly audit cycle. Kezia Marsh, 8 weeks in, had already flagged 2 irregular vendor invoice sequences that turned out to be administrative errors rather than fraud. But the point was she had flagged them, and the system now had a process for responding when someone did. There would be other things. There always were. Institutions were not fixed by one case. They were fixed by the slow accumulation of people who decided to look closely and keep looking, who documented what they found, who used the channels that existed and built new ones when the existing ones failed. It was unglamorous and often unrewarded work, and it required exactly the tolerance for operating without recognition that Mara had developed by accident and now understood as essential. What she wanted to tell the nursing student, what she would say if she ever found the right words, was this. The moments that determine who you are almost never the large ones. They're the small ones, the ones that happen when no one is watching and the outcome isn't guaranteed, and the correct thing is also the hard thing, and you do it anyway because the alternative is being a person who saw something and looked away. You don't know in those moments that they'll matter. You find out later. She opened a new document on her computer, typed a header at the top, Compliance Reporting Framework, Staff Guide, Draft 1. Began to write. Outside her window, the Caldervane morning was doing what mornings do. Light advancing, people moving through the parking lot with their coffee cups and their key cards. Another shift beginning in the building that was hers to help keep honest. She had work to do. She did it.